Hello and welcome to Wisdom and Productivity, the podcast of Dr. Efraín Martinez. I am a principal in search of wisdom, and I have found the productivity to be a great tool for success. Today, I have the great and distinguished honor of interviewing Mark Anthony Gooden, who is the Christian Johnson Endeavor Professor in Educational Leadership and the Director of the Endeavor Antiracist and Restorative Leadership Initiative in the Department of Organization and Leadership at Teachers College at Columbia University. His research focuses on culturally responsive school leadership with specific interest in the principalship, anti-racist leadership, urban educational leadership, and legal issues in education. With Sharon Radd, Gretchen Givens Generett, and George Theoharis, Mark co-authored the book Five Practices for Equity-Focused School Leadership, which I was able to read and I was honored to be able to read it in advance. Mark Anthony Gooden, who are you?
Thank you, Dr. Martinez, for that great introduction.
Thank you.
Yes. So who am I? I see myself on this journey as a learner. Certainly, I've been in roles where I have been a teacher and obviously at this level, a professor. But I find myself really enhanced more and more by the opportunity to continue to learn. So if I had to describe myself in one word, I would say I am definitely a learner. I do like to engage with practitioners and scholars as well. I believe I'm someone who sees myself as joining and connecting those worlds. So, for example, I've given keynotes in school districts like Eanes Independent School District. I've had the honor to talk to diverse groups like the U.S. Customs and Border Protection Agency about leadership. But also, I've been able to travel internationally in some respects and talk to groups like the British Education Leadership Management and Administration Society, just to name a few. So I see myself again as a learner in all those spaces, but someone who can share knowledge and co-learn with the individuals I get a chance to engage with.
Beautiful. So, Mark, can you share with us your origin story? What happened before today?
Oh yes. So my origin story. I love the sound of that. It makes me seem like I'm a superhero, but I'm just a practical guy. So I will say, I was one of those folks who started out with the opportunity to go to the university in my home city, and that was Albany State College at the time. And I was a kid who didn't know a lot about the institution, but was really blessed to have such a jewel right there in my midst. So I got a chance to go. I majored in engineering initially. I changed my major to mathematics. I was still searching and trying to figure out what I wanted to be when I grew up. And at the end of my academic career as an undergraduate, I got the opportunity through my fraternity to tutor some kids in mathematics. And it literally changed my life. It was a situation where I sat down with them, just showing them some concepts, really describing to them ways in which I learned these concepts. And those kids came back and said, you really helped us out. We went from being students who were on the brink of failing to now making like B's, B pluses, and in some cases, a couple of A's. So I said, wow. I said, no, there's no way. And they said, oh, absolutely. And so that gave me an opportunity to think about what it would mean if I considered becoming an educator. So I took a couple of courses in education before I graduated and ended up getting a scholarship to go to the Ohio State University, go Bucks, to really major in mathematics education. So I wanted to become a teacher, needed to take some more courses in pedagogy and a number of other classes. And that began my career as an educator. And from there, I stayed in education, of course, and had aspirations of going into leadership. And that led into a PhD and a master's in policy and leadership, still at Ohio State. After which I had a chance to go into my first career job as a assistant professor at the University of Cincinnati. Spent about 7 to 8 years there, and then was recruited to the University of Texas at Austin. And in both of those cases, I got the opportunity to lead principal preparation programs And then finally, I was recruited to Teachers College, Columbia University, about 6 years ago. So that's kind of the path. There are some bumps and bruises along the way, and some opportunities to learn, and definitely meeting some exciting people who've had a great amount of influence on me. Who some of whom I'll talk about later in the program.
Well, and Mark, follow-up question. What lessons have you learned teaching in such a prestigious institution like the Teachers College?
Oh my goodness, so many lessons. So I'm just coming off of a stint as the department chair of organization and leadership, and I have to honestly say that has been one of the major challenges in my journey in terms of learning, but it's also been incredibly rewarding to work with colleagues, just a bunch of really sharp and intelligent people, which wouldn't surprise folks, but also people who I think have been truly world changers. And I got the honor of being able to lead them. And so that was a true application of some of the concepts from my learning over the 22 years as being a professor, and some of the concepts which we discussed in the book of 5 practices for equity focused school leadership. And I would say that one of the highest honors was paid to me by a couple of colleagues who just said, you know, they had also read the book and said to me, you really strive to live out these principles. And that has really been a benefit to us in our department. And of course, along the way, I got a chance to read the research of my colleagues a little more closely and get to know them as individuals, but also engage with the fantastic students that we have in the Department of Organization and Leadership. So there's been much learning along the way, obviously applying the research and then getting a chance to recognize that there are newer questions that need to be asked. And so I'm now coming off of that leadership stint, getting ready to engage in some of those questions.
Beautiful. And before we jump into the questions of the books, two more personal questions. If you have to gift someone two books, one fiction and one nonfiction, which books would those be?
Oh my goodness. Ah, wow. Well, I would imagine that for the nonfiction book, I would definitely say Where Do We Go From Here? Community of Chaos. And I've sort of been jumping into that book. I go in and out of it. And that's of course by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who really writes about some of the major challenges we have in our country from his perspective during that time. Um, but it's instructive, and I find that it's also applicable to some of the things that are happening, today. Um, and as far as man, there's so many books that fiction books, but I'll just go with this one because this is the one that's coming to mind. I'm gonna say Derek Bell's "And We Are Not Saved." Um, yeah, it's like there were a couple coming to mind, but that's the one that's coming up right now. And my reason for presenting that fiction to people is Derek Bell writes in this book, and for folks who don't know, Derek Bell is considered to be the father of critical race theory, and also a was an attorney during the civil rights movement, and did a lot, I think, for in helping us think about educations, starting with the Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954, but so many others. And the reason I like this as a powerful work of fiction is Derek uses allegory, like a lot of critical race theories. He uses story, narrative, in many cases, fact-based narratives to tell the stories of what's happening in our country, and to really help us understand a little more deeply about how we can grapple with some of these issues. But he does it with these really um, just incredibly powerful stories, and he does it through, in this particular book, through the shero in the book is called Geneva Crenshaw, and she is an African American woman who's a powerful lawyer who's really very much committed to supporting and serving her people. And the narrator has all these conversations back and forth about some of the things that are happening during the time that are fact based, but then they have these discussions about how to do it. And it's really, really well done. It's like if you want to read scholarship that really tells you a powerful story about the complex issues that are happening in our country, but at the same time, it's entertaining and engaging in the way in which he's done. It's really quite creative. So that would be the work of fiction that I would present to people.
Beautiful. You know, as I was reading the book, I was wondering who is or who are your biggest influences?
Oh my goodness. So there are folks who have influenced me in the academy and who have influenced me in my life of learning as a student, even during the K-12 setting, and folks I think who inspired me to be teachers. And I'll talk about them really quickly, but I just want to also pay honor to my mother as my first teacher, and my mother really helped me understand that even though we were growing up in humble circumstances, and we didn't have certainly a lot of financial resources, but she instilled in me kind of the love of just the written word and the spoken word, and just really instilled in me the ability to be able to strive and do well academically, but also reminded me of the need to help people and to support folks. So even when you didn't have a lot and we did not, she always found ways to share with people. She could share a good word with folks. She would motivate them, and she was always open to giving people her last. And I would always be kind of amazed by that. And so she taught me early on this notion of sacrifice. You can be blessed and you can have things, but you have to understand what it means to sacrifice and to help people and to lift people up. So I say all that to say she started me on this journey of moving toward education. And as a result, helped me recognize that when she couldn't support me in understanding what it meant to go to college, she certainly could recommend to me this idea that you should talk to people who have had those experiences, and going to folks with an open heart, with a commitment to learning and supporting others, always seemed to open more doors for me. And my mother taught me that without expressly saying that's what it was. I mean, I know maybe it was me, maybe it was my thick-headedness as a teenager and not getting it, but somehow I look back and say, oh my goodness, these are all the things that she was sharing and helping me understand. And so so that led to me really meeting uh a guy named William A. Webb, who became my first my algebra teacher in 8th grade, who also was the football coach, who also was the basketball coach, who was a Black man who helped me understand what it meant to be academically engaged around content that I really loved and appreciated, which I had an early love for mathematics. The second person is a woman who I call like my school mother, who was Judy Thomas, who also was a mathematics teacher, who just really was absolutely engaged with students and motivating and inspiring in so many ways. And so I didn't realize it until the story I was telling you earlier, that even as I was tutoring kids, I was teaching things that had been taught to me by Mr. Webb and Miss Thomas. And then I was sort of going into this circle like, wow, falling into education, because that's not what I originally wanted to be initially. I can remember I was telling my daughter just the other day, I was on the path to become an engineer. I was the president of the Southeastern Consortium for Minorities in Engineering. But engineering just didn't resonate with me. It just didn't connect as well. But the elegance and the sort of purity I saw in mathematics did resonate with me, and so that's how I ended up in that major. And those are the people who influenced me in a big way. And there are a number of folks along the way, people like Linda Carroll Tillman in the academy, who helped me understand what it means to become a professor, but also have a connection to your people and the people you are there to support, and the folks who have in turn supported you to get there.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing. So, as one of the authors of the 5 practices for equity focused school leadership, could you provide us an overview of this book and explain what are these 5 practices?
Yes, absolutely. We'd be glad to do that. So in short, the 5 practices start with prioritizing equity leadership. And I let me go through them first, and then I can come back and
Sure.
movement. And the second practice really is to prepare your mind, prepare yourself intellectually, um, and emotionally to engage in equity leadership. In other words, we're taking you on this journey to learn more about yourself and your identity as a leader. And so through that, we talk about this process in ways that help you reflect. Of course, you're going to react to some of this work emotionally, and that's okay. But we also want you to repeat this work, each and every day as you engage. So prioritizing equity, preparing yourself for equity, and then the third one, speaking of superheroes, you can think about the Avengers. We want you to assemble a team. This is really important work. It's engaging work, but it's also very tiring and not the kind of work you want to take on your own. So assemble a team, an equity leadership team. We would hope that you would call them that. At least have them focus on those principles, and then move that team with you along this process toward change. You want to really be changing and disrupting some of those inequitable systems, and then going into a space where you can replace them with equitable systems that are supportive of kids who've been marginalized because of their identity. And then last but not least, we want you to move into a space to sustain this equity work. We want this work to be with us and really become a part of your system of change. And we are really working to disrupt inequitable systems. So we have to have a system of equity. So I would say that those definitely are, those are the five practices in a nutshell. But I'm happy to continue talking about them. But that's as you've read the book, which I'm really excited to hear some of your thoughts, some more questions about it. But those are the five practices as I see them.
I really appreciated how the book challenges us to reflect on how we are feeling, because sometimes it can be a little bit tough to realize, oh my goodness, I am part of the problem. Even though every day I feel like I come here to do all these changes, but sometimes we also live in these systems with all these problems, and we allow many things to do. So it really challenged my thinking. So, can you pick a story from the book where prioritizing equity became a defining factor in someone's leadership journey?
Oh, yes, yes, yes. So I'm thinking of a principal that I've had an opportunity to work with who really has, I believe, embodied like the five practices in her work. And one of the things she's done a number of things, but one of the ways she did this is prioritizing equity by going to her leadership team and her teachers and explaining to them that one of the ways to get into this work is to really reflect on who you are. To your point, Dr. Martinez.
Mhm.
But and it's not but in the way in which she wanted to do that initially is to go into a reflection as we talk about these racial reflections. And so she created a racial autobiography um, for herself, and she created it in a way that was shareable to her colleagues, and she did just that. But in the process of doing that, she reminded them that this was something that really was important for my leadership, really was eye-opening for me. It really helped me see a number of blind sides, even as a Black woman who's a leader of a school, because a lot of folks think, oh, okay, race is just if you're Black, you kind of get all of it. You understand everything. And sometimes people make those kinds of assumptions. But she did that. And then she said to her staff, this is what I'm doing, but this is why I need you to do it. And so that was a really powerful way of prioritizing equity and also opening up and being very vulnerable about that as a leader. Because sometimes in these present times, we get confused. We think in order to be the leader, I have to be the person to stand in front of everybody. I have to stick my chest out. I have to be infallible. I have to do all these things. And what we realize that leadership really is, if you're going to be effective, if you're going to influence people, oftentimes it's a very personal endeavor, right? And leaders feel that, especially when they feel the bumps and the bruises. If we have been in leadership roles, uh, people tend to find ways to let us know when we have made mistakes or when we have been
Certainly.
ineffective. That somehow that gets back to us, right? And rather than just feeling that privately and turning it over, we're really saying in the book, think about leadership differently. When you say develop an equity leadership team, think about rather than being the expert who knows it all, who has all the answers, think about being the person who recognizes the leadership in your space. Think about running your meetings differently. And I realize I'm moving over and spilling over into that practice three, but I think we have some important lessons in there for folks to understand that this is very difficult work. And for a lot of people, when you raise the question of equity or ask, are we being inequitable? People are going to take it personally. Another story I'll just share as a bonus. I remember working with a leader who identified as a Latino man, and he was recognizing some discrepancies in the discipline reports in terms of the referrals specifically. And he noticed that there were a couple of teachers who were responsible for a high percentage of the discipline referrals. That was one thing he noticed. The second thing he noticed is that there also was a large number of Black and Brown students at the top of this teacher's list. This is an issue that we have recognized when we start thinking about collective paradigms or systems paradigms. We've recognized this as a nation. We have statistics on this. We have research about this. So on a very practical one-on-one level, he approached this teacher and just was like, hey, I know this, and I'm trying to, he went in to explain and say, look, I would love to be able to support you in this, but immediately, this is a step in terms of prioritizing equity and trying to have a one-on-one. There was a reaction, and this was a white teacher who was a woman. I mean, had an emotional reaction. She broke down in tears and said, you know, at the end of the conversation, before the middle of the conversation, are you calling me a racist? Said, that's not what I'm doing at all. I'm trying to figure out ways to support our kids and support you because I'm noticing a pattern and I'm just wondering kind of what's that. And so, you know, it was kind of a back and forth. But because, once again, that is a person who had an opportunity to learn in a cohort with fellow students to grapple with some of these questions around race and culture and identity, could recognize what they were experiencing from that teacher, but at the same time, really try to work through that thicket of issues and say, how can I remind this teacher, I'm trying to support you, but ultimately, we've got to support our kids because I feel like there's a pattern here. And so that is difficult to do. Those are difficult conversations to have. But we believe that they're necessary and they are also possible. And we believe they can be facilitated by what we present to folks through the book.
So, Mark, a follow-up question because this is it is it seems so simple in principle to address these things, but our whole entire country is breaking each other apart, and equity is at the center of that controversy. What advice do you have for school leaders who are trying to implement equity focused initiatives? Like, what is the pre work that they should do to ensure that the environment is going to be safer than someone jumping to the conclusion, are you calling me a racist? And immediately there's a stop to any progress because people are going to feel uh, like they're being personally attacked.
Yes. So thank you for that question. I feel like there's an urgency and a charge to engage in this work. And yes, we do have people who feel that way. And we do have people who say, you know, I don't like the way it makes me feel when you bring this content up. And I feel like, even if you're not saying it directly, that you're calling me a racist. And I said, okay, those are folks who maybe are on your team and you feel a need to work with them. But sometimes there are also these external people who are screaming this loudly. But we have to be mindful that if we really allow the conversation to be co-opted by those folks, I mean, there are ways, I'm going to talk about it a little bit about how we can, you know, help the conversation move forward and support those people. But I want to be clear. We don't want those folks to co-opt the conversation, because historically that has happened. And by co-opting the conversation, they really decrease the importance and the urgency on kids who are not getting access to education. Mainly, not exclusively, but almost mainly Black and brown kids who have suffered in our educational system for far too long because somebody didn't feel good about broaching this topic. So when I say co-opt, I'm using that word strategically and intentionally. Co-opting the conversation means you shift the focus on your feelings, which I'm not saying are not important, but your feelings are not so important that they get to carry the weight of the day and take the emphasis away from those kids who, if we allow ourselves to continue doing this for another decade or another set of decades, are not going to get access to their education in the way in which it's supposed to. They're supposed to. They're not going to be people who can participate fully in the democracy. They're not going to be folks who are going to get access to a higher quality of life. You may already have access to those things, and you can be in your feelings in a very safe place. But we have to recognize, and I say this when I engage with leaders, we have to recognize that there's an urgency around this work. In fact, going back to Chaos of Community in Dr. King's book, he was in 1965, 66, 67, explaining to us what white backlash is. He was saying then, it's not a new thing for prejudice to come out. It's not a new thing for insecurities to come out, that prejudice mask that's insecure. It's not a new thing. He was calling folks on the carpet saying, you've got to work through those, because as a country, we have things that are happening to people of color that really can be laid at the feet of folks who say, hey, I don't feel comfortable with that. Hey, I don't think we should do that. I think that's too much too soon. In another one of his books that's popularly titled, he's like, why we can't wait. This is what it reminds me of. Dr. King said, look, folks who are in privileged positions will say to you, hey, Dr. King, I know you want rights for your people, but that's too much too fast. People will say to us, I'll just update that to say, we are about equitable education for kids. We're about getting them to full access. That's it. Whoa, that's too much too fast. Let's take it a little bit slower. Well, there are folks who have been waiting on us since 1954 to go hurry up and go fast and do something that's going to work for their kids. And so when their kids have been in the system, sometimes these people have 2 or 3 children who've gone through a broken system. It's heartbreaking for us to say to them, if you could just wait a little bit longer, I believe we're going to do some things. And by the way, my feelings have been hurt. And so by you bringing that up, I feel like it's very divisive. And so it really wasn't an issue. I mean, I have had people say to me, I've gone in districts to try to support leaders, and the leaders were on board and ready to go. But they had board members who were being influenced by a small subset of folks who, even though it was a small subset, was very loud and politically influential, that was saying, hey, we did not have an issue until Gooden showed up. And I said, this is very interesting. So because I feel like I was caught in because folks said you had an issue, but it was that thing that when other people were saying they had an issue and no actual steps were taken to alleviate the pain of certain folks, or let me be clear, Black and brown people, for instance, when their voice was not heard, you said there was no issue. But when you found that there was something done that was credible that you can see, you then shifted and said that was the issue, versus saying, wow, there may be something going on here that we need to recognize. And suffice it to say, I don't want to put too much stock into my showing up. Folks had data that showed that there were issues. In the book, we talk about this process of going through an equity audit, and we have an example included in the book. And I don't want to deceive people. Equity audits, in many ways, confirm what we already know. there are also other types of data that have been collected, quantitative and qualitative, that confirm what we already know. In many cases, districts do that so that they can have that clear evidence so that those naysayers can say, we can show it to them. But I submit to folks, we have to be careful that we don't make the equity audit the purpose of the work that we're doing or the aim or the goal. And then once we've done the audit, which we have to be mindful, it can be a huge undertaking. We don't want it to be, once we've done the audit, we've now confirmed that, wow, we have an issue, but we're so worn out that we don't really have space and time and mental energy to focus on what that issue is. I think you have to be doing, it's a both and. I think a lot of folks know, just in the situation that I was describing, that one-on-one, there are many, many stories like that in schools, and educators know that, right? And good educators know as well. They have a pretty good grasp of where some of those issues are. And we've been in schools, we've worked with educators, and I have students in classes, I go in schools, and even though there may not be that written confirmation, a teacher who's attentive to what's happening in her or his class can say, "Oh no, but we have this, we have that." I can, and I have faith in those folks if they're committed professionals who are serious about doing the work, and we have to be there to listen and support them as they move in that direction.
Well, Margaret, you mentioned King. I'm listening to the new bio that came out, and it describes how when Brown versus Board was enacted, that as a symbolic act, individuals would bring 19, 20 children to be registered and for them to be not accepted, or how businesses that were not black owned will join forces to impede access to black folks to go in. And now that we are in, we have this impediment of, like you say, the small group who's making the biggest scandal, and it impedes progress. So for people in the trenches like me and other school leaders, like for example superintendents, what advice do you have to cultivate or set the stage, cultivate positive relationship to the coming of an audit result that might hurt the feelings of some, because that seems to always be a great impediment? What can we do? What is the pre-work that we can do to try to diminish that negative impact that tends to happen?
Absolutely, great question. I would say, first and foremost, you said something very powerful earlier, recognizing our role in this whole process, recognizing our role in the systems work that needs to be done, being very honest and upfront how we may, and you admit, and I would say to people how I may start with the I statements, may have contributed to this inequitable system, right? And so you've had to prepare yourself through reading. Obviously, I believe the book is a great place to start. But what does it mean to prioritize yourself, prioritize equity leadership? Well, within that chapter, within that section, we talk about understanding levels of inequity, understanding historically what has happened. Like I talk about what King's work and what really makes me. I mean, I embrace other scholars. I mean, as well, and other leaders and writers. But his work clarifies how some of these cycles work, right? And by going through and prioritizing equity leadership, recognizing that there are historical inequities, there are structural inequities, right? There are institutional inequities. Even before we get to this space of people feeling like we're calling you a racist, okay, that's more about you. We're talking about inequities in the system that limit the access of kids. And because you are not conscious of those you tend to reproduce that system and call it fair. And so that's one of the things I would say, preparing yourself, going through your own work. I would recommend, for instance, white educators definitely go through a racial reflection, definitely go through that section so that as a white educator, you could very well be called a racist by a black person. Don't take it personally. Ask yourself, why would that happen? What are the things that, because that person may be seeing you enact a system that's supposed to be neutral, that's actually inequitable, and they're feeling that every day. So ask yourself, what does that mean, and why did that happen to me? And I actually have a piece in goodness, it came to me. I know there's one in Ed Week, and there's one. It's in education leadership, which leaders can access. Where um, we had done this work. I'd done this work with some of my principals, aspiring principals, and I went back after some years after they had become principals and asked if they were still using their racial autobiography. That's the work I'm referring to. And I thought I'll call them up, and perhaps they won't be using this. Perhaps it won't have a lot to do with their practice. And I was pleasantly surprised to hear them say, "Oh no, I pulled it out. I've expanded this racial autobiography. I've responded to people saying things about. I've moved into a space of leading some of my colleagues through it." And so I say all that to say, doing your own work, doing your own reading is going to be so much more powerful. And I remind leaders all the time, reading the book is a start, but the book also reminds you that you have to engage in this work because it's a part of your learning. Five Practices for Equity Focused School Leadership is a book that you can read, but there are current articles that come up. There are current situations that happen. As a leader, challenge yourself. Ask yourself, why did this happen and what do I think about it? And I remind folks all the time that even though we have this country where we don't talk about racial inequity directly, but if you watch the news, if you see things in it, if you have it, you see examples of inequities every week. And so it should be somehow curious to us. And I always, that's one of the things I say is, really learning and moving forward and growing is available to the courageous, the committed, the courageous and committed folks. And the caring, they get access to these things because you should be curious about it and saying, oh, good, interesting. How is it that we're talking about inequities in the world, but when I bring them up in a classroom setting, or when I try to say historically what has happened in this country and the contributions that people of color have made, some people say, oh no, that's critical race theory stuff used in a negative way, different from
Yes.
using earlier.
Mm-hmm,
So,
mm-hmm.
isn't that interesting? It is a part of our learning. As a matter of fact, I recently saw a news story that was talking about the Treme community in New Orleans. And for folks who don't know, that's a Black community in New Orleans. And this is a part that I teach in my doctoral course about how so many communities of color have been decimated by the construction of freeways. The freeways were constructed to get access for folks in the suburbs to the city so they can go to work. And so they cut these through communities of people of color who didn't have or would seem to not have as much political power. Now, that was something that people say, oh, that was done historically, and those communities have been able to bounce back, and those people should be fine now. Well, it turns out that those freeways create noise pollution. They pollute the air through carcinogens coming out of the exhaust pipes of cars. And people live around these freeways because some of those communities, what was left. So what does that mean? What they found is the folks living in those communities have higher incidences of asthma, lung disease. They have to live with noise pollution. So there was a professor at LSU who took her undergraduates out, and they went in and they just walked around the community and measured all three of those things. And they said, oh my God, this is off the charts in terms of the pollution, the noise. And those folks are fighting, mostly Black people in this community, to get rid of those freeways. Now, why do I give that example? That is an example in this country of how we did something bad historically. We structured it in a way so that it was placed in particular communities, and we institutionalized it by law saying this was legal and we have to do it, and it's for the good of the greater good. And we didn't ask, or we probably asked very few, we didn't ask people in that community. We told them what was happening. One of the community residents said, I remember She said, one day I just recognized I woke up and there was a bulldozer. Nobody said anything to us. We didn't get any notice. It was just one day the bulldozer was there. One day people were saying we're reclaiming this by eminent domain. You have so that is the example of how we have historically marginalized people, and it has remained with us. But if we don't raise that question and talk about it in the sense that it impacted one group of people because they were regarded as not having as much political power, then we are doing ourselves a disservice as a country, because that is a group of citizens who are trying their best to come together as citizens and make their community better. And we should be standing shoulder to shoulder with them. But yet we're saying, no, that makes me feel uncomfortable. You know?
Wow. Mark, there's a lot of in the news, a lot of the negative side of these initiatives. For example, a nearby suburb where I work at, they brought someone to do an equity audit, and this person was called both in social media and in person the same racial epithets that Rosa Parks may have heard when she will get in the bus. So people feel unsafe, and this person, this consultant, ended up just leaving. Can you share with us at least one experience where you have seen or learned about that it came out positive, that an equity audit was done and the district was able to improve as a unit because they were able to address issues that were right there in front of their faces?
Yes. So yes, a very good question. Again, I think we have to be careful when we engage in these practices, because there's a lot of energy committed to oftentimes there's a lot of energy committed to doing an equity audit, and keeping those goals in mind is very important. And even though we offer that as a tool, I want to be clear. We oftentimes have other ways of conducting these assessments and can recognize that we can do the work. So I'm just going to give an example of a district, for instance, that came to terms and recognized that it had an issue. It was helped into that process by, let's just call it a community needs assessment. It wasn't a formal equity audit, but it was a case where um, there were students who had gone to social media and said that these are the things that are happening. We're being called, we're being called the N word every day, or we're finding instances of that happening. Somebody's being called the N word, and there's not enough of a response to it. So it's uneven. Sometimes teachers may say, "Don't say that. You can't." And sometimes teachers act like they don't ignore it. And then they would say, if in the event that a kid decides to stand up for themselves and say, "Hey, you really shouldn't be doing that. I don't like it when you do. Would you please stop?" Which is a courageous thing for a child to do, to say to a peer. The response would be, "Oh, you're just so sensitive. I was only joking with you. That's just a joke." Well, when a person says to you, "That hurts my feelings, and I don't like when you say that," and that word has a history, you can't. And again, that's a power play to say that. So why do I say that? Because so the kids started, and it kind of snowballed, but it was a needs assessment by pointing out data points. It happened today. It happened today. It happened today. There were other instances that happened as a result of that. Then there were like inequities found, and so they kind of had a, let's just say, an informal, organic equity audit, if you will. Now, given that that happened, the board and the district leaders needed to make a decision about how they were going to respond, and the community was there to hold them accountable. That was very public. An equity audit can be the same thing. Do the equity audit, and don't we have a lot of variables in there, but don't feel like you have to use all of those. Think about where you think that there's some issues in your environment. Do the needs assessment for your environment, even if you just say, okay, we're going to look at access to higher level courses. There are challenges around tracking and those kinds of things. We know that, but let's just say that that's where you want to start, and you want to look at the racial and cultural makeup of those courses, and you start there. If you find that there's an issue, what steps will you follow with that? If you don't have concrete steps to follow, if you don't have an idea about how we're going to change policy, it can get lost in the sauce, so to speak. So people start it's almost like people forget, like oh man, we did this equity audit, we found all these data, and now what? And I have to say, that's why I say to folks, you don't have to start the work after the audit. Many educators have school level data that says, for instance, one where you can have data that's already been conducted for you is inequities in suspension. Okay, we have this disparity issue. Like I said earlier, that's a national issue. We talk about that in the book, right? You can get access to those data from the Office for Civil Rights. Anybody can put in, if you're in a public school, you can put in your school, you can put in your district, and you can see. More often than not, if you have a diverse student body, you're going to have some inequities that are going to come out there. If you have oversubscribing of kids in special education, by race and culture, you're going to see it there. What are some steps that you can take to do something about that now that you are aware? And so I say to people, consider that your informal needs assessment, your informal equity audit, if you will. Those data are legitimate because you've already collected those as a school. And many, I'm giving you Office of Civil Rights data. But many schools, all schools have collected some kind of data. And they know that, right? So and so those data are available, and leaders, I look to leaders to lead those conversations and share with the other staff in the building about what's available and what we can do about this to address it. Because if you do not address it, folks recognize, and if they don't know, folks can make complaints to the Office for Civil Rights, right? And indeed that has happened. And parents can call and say, look, we've got, I think, something that's there's disparities happening. There can be an investigation around that. And so, as the things that they'll come in and looking for is like, do you have disparate impact, right? Is this something that you say is neutral, but then it ends up having impacting folks differently based on their identity, and so if you have that kind of situation, and disparate impact is one, of course, then that's an example of things that we may already know, but we have decided not to do anything about them or move in an intentional way to change them.
So that is something that principals can easily do. We get the data, we bring it to our teams, we let them go through that, and it will be easy for them to conclude, yikes, we are suspending African American kids and Latino kids way more than we are doing. And we acknowledge that. What is
Yes.
next? What can principals do to support that group when when the grief ends, when they realize, yikes, we're doing this? What can we do? What's the next step that we can do?
Absolutely. So as I was saying earlier, um, thinking about what what is it that we do in terms of how we discipline kids. So like research tells us that we tend to watch African American and Latino kids more. People say, well, they're the ones who are misbehaving the most. Not necessarily true. They're the ones we're watching the most. So when they do something, got you, right? So is that happening in our school? We can assess that. The other thing is people say, well, there are rules and there's a code of conduct, and as far as we can tell, it's pretty neutral. Well, oftentimes when we take a closer look at it, it isn't, right? We find that if there are things that Black and brown kids tend to do a little bit more, we find sometimes they're too specific on our list. And so, being somebody who's taught school law, we talk about rules being, vague and overbroad. That's so vague that people who don't know what it is, and somebody could look at it and they be like, I don't know what it was telling me to do or not to do. But there's also the case that some things can be so specific that they really focus on particular kinds of kids, of particular kids that kids like to express themselves, right? So look at our rules. And then last but not least, research also tells us that even when we have rules that are not biased on their face, they're biased in terms of how they are applied. So going back to that group that you watching more, when you're hyper vigilant, when it comes to that group, we find that they are receiving more severe punishments for the same infractions at a higher rate. And if we don't take note of looking at those numbers, we tend to not look at them until it's too late. And then a final point I'll say, just to wrap this up, is we have to have some awareness of this issue as it relates to race and culture. And some people don't want to discuss that. Some people don't want to address it. You may be familiar with the phenomenon of folks going to a system of restorative practices. And I like the concept of restorative practices, which says, we're going to do no harm. We're going to restore restore folks in a sense and build a community and create spaces where there are circles and we can continue to have people as a part of the community. And when they do something, we're going to focus on the behavior and not the person. We're going to try to correct the behavior and not exclude the person from the community. Generally speaking, I'm not probably doing restorative practices justice, but you folks, your listeners will get the point. Well, folks have found that when educators have been trained in restorative practices with some fidelity, they have found that their suspensions have gone down. However, I've seen at least in one instance, and I've also talked to a colleague who's done this work, who actually did her dissertation on this. And what she found and others have found that when folks did not engage in conversations around race and culture, while their suspensions may have gone down, what do you think happened with the disparity?
Wow.
See, the disparity remained. It was like, oh, it went down from 20% to 10%. But my goodness, that disparity is still there. And the challenge with that is people try to do shortcuts, right? Or people just said, we're just going to embrace restorative practices. Oh my goodness, we don't have to deal with that stuff around racial inequity, all that inequities. Just do restorative practices will save us. But the challenge is we didn't really ask ourselves, who are we? And that's the question you started with, Dr. Martinez, for me. Who am I in this whole process of engaging with racial inequity? Who am I? Because if I don't know who I am in this process, I may very well run the risk of repeating the status quo. I may very well run the risk of being a nice shiny cog in this wheel of anti-progress, right? This wheel that continues to create inequities without knowing it. And so if we don't know who we are as educators, if we don't reflect upon that, it doesn't mean that we're bad people. It doesn't mean that we're racist automatically. We may have really good intentions about this, and nobody wants to continue moving toward what would be considered as of old like prejudice and bigotry. But the reality is, in the tip of that triangle that I was describing earlier with those multiple levels of inequity, is the interpersonal piece. It clouds our judgment, and we think just because I'm nice to folks and I interact and I try to be good to everybody, I'm not going to be the person who ends up with more African American and Latino kids being suspended in my class. But what if I am? What does it mean? What does that say to me, right? For a lot of people, the first thing they think is, "Oh my God, that says you're saying I'm a racist." Going back to our narrative earlier, you're saying that I'm not a nice person. You're saying I'm a bigot for all practical purposes. But I remind people that's old way. That's the old way of thinking about this, right? That's the socially unacceptable way of thinking about this work. But what it turns out is, if you think about those other levels I've described, just as a review, institutional, right, structural, and historical inequities. Those are the ones below the level on the pyramid. If we think about those, those actually end up being the socially acceptable ways to really rob kids of their education, right? Those end up being the social acceptable ways to really keep kids in inequitable situations and support that kind of, um, I'll just say, foolishness, right? And so we just have to be aware that's not what we want to do. And if it's not what we want to do, we have to really demonstrate that we're committed to the work to break down those inequitable systems.
Wow, what a masterclass. I feel I'm a better educator already.
Thank you.
Mark, what advice do you have for those aspiring to be school leaders who may be thinking about all these issues and thinking, yikes, I just want to be a principal, and realizing that they will have to face these things? What advice do you have to them as they embark on this journey?
Yeah, very good question. Well, first of all, the first thing I'll say to you, if you're interested in doing that work, I would, really just say thank you, in appreciation for wanting to do it and wanting to be committed to what I think is one of the most important jobs in this country. Now, that said, I always remind folks that it is going to be a thankless job, right? But if you subscribe to the principles that are discussed in 5 practices for equity focused school leadership, you're going to be a better leader, right? You're going to be a person who recognizes that this is a work of a community and there are many communities that can support you. We literally say to folks, we don't want you to be a hero leader. Hero leadership may look good initially, it may even feel good up to a point, but it tends to wear people down too quickly. And the job is just too big for one person to take it on. So what I like, what I appreciate about our book is when we look through the this work, it is the culmination of 4 folks who've been in education on average. When we started the book, all of us had about 20 years each in education, working at different levels. And one of the things we noticed, it took us a while to write the book because we like each other and it was important to come together as a community. But we recognized the power of others, the power of other people in the community working on these major issues. And so, as a principal, recognizing early on and build community. Obviously, we hear things about develop strong relationships. Yes, that's good, and we talk about that in the book. But in a sense, you really are building community. You're developing opportunities to learn with people. And there will be times, there will be a lot of times where you're going to deal with some really difficult content, and you're going to have to go to those same people. But having a relationship and having built community with them is it's almost like you're talking to a family member, and there's a lot of care in there, a lot of curiosity and consideration for each other as you move toward work on what can seem in many days, honestly, like an intractable issue if I listen to the leaders, but who have learned that when I'm doing this work, I'm certainly relying on a number of people with a lot of great resources and great ideas to support me in this work.
Beautiful. Mark Anthony, what's next in your educational leadership journey?
Oh, thank you. Well, for me, my institution has graciously granted me a sabbatical, and I'm going to be working this year on doing a lot of writing and research as a professor. It is a real blessing to be able to have done leadership and then be able to step away out of that space and go back into the professorate. I mean, if I finish my career like this, I will be a blessed man. I don't have to do anything more. I do get opportunities of people calling and asking me to consider some other roles and exciting ones, I might add. But right now, I'm very content just doing more reading and writing and learning. I mean, it brings us back full circle to what I said earlier. If I can just be a learner just the rest of my days in this space, I'll be a happy man.
Beautiful. And my final question is, when the curtain closes and you're just Mark Anthony, what do you do for fun?
Oh well, I have a 16-year-old daughter, and she's always able to aptly and roundly criticize me for my dad jokes. But just hanging out with her. It's been great to learn alongside her and to really teach her things that I know, and to listen and learn from her. I'm also, I'm a husband as well, and so as a family, it's fun for us to hang out. And one of my really wonderful experiences. I like to read, of course, as a scholar. It's kind of a thing as it's almost an occupational hazard, but it's also one of those things I do for fun. And I had a chance to read The Bluest Eye with my daughter, and it was just so great reading with her
Fun.
the book and hearing her take on it. And it's written by, of course, the great Toni Morrison,
Hmm.
but it's also one of those books that's ended up on one of those banned lists, right? And so it was just great to sit and read with her, her assignment, and get my perspective. So that's it. Just kind of spending time with her. Sometimes, doing whatever she wants to do, going to the movies. And I'm just amazed that at 16, every now and then she's like, you want to go to the movies? And I'm like, yes, of course. So yeah, it's fun.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Mark. A pleasure and an honor to have you in the show.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Martinez. Been a
Take
pleasure.
care. Have a good one.
You too. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to Wisdom and Productivity, the podcast of Dr. Efraín Martinez.
Chulo.
And that production. Chill out.